Hello, everybody, and welcome to Drafting with Data, the video series where I break down the 17 lands draft data so that you have actionable takeaways and can learn how to interpret the numbers yourself. In this episode, I'm going to be examining the color performance section of the website. But before I get into that, I want to remind you that if you enjoyed this video and enjoy the Drafting with Data series, remember to hit that thumbs up button and comment below to give me your feedback and let me know that you want to see future episodes, and subscribe to the channel for more draft content and to make sure you catch future episodes of this series. So, without further ado, let's dive into it. Basically, this section of the website is accessed by going to Analytics and then Format Color Rankings. And if you've never seen 17lands.com before, it is basically a website where users can download the app so that it can track their own draft data, and then it aggregates all of that data into one site so that they have a large enough sample size to actually get some cool information about the format. So if you're interested, you can check it out. You can just look at 17lands.com. But this is essentially the color performance tab, which shows the win rates of various colors in Midnight Hunt Premier Draft. So the most important thing to check at the very beginning is to go all the way to the bottom and look at the all decks category, and you can see what the win percentage of a 17 lands user on average is, so that you're going from a known baseline. So it looks like the baseline is 56.1% win rate. So numbers above that indicate above average performance, and numbers below that indicate below average performance. The next category you're going to want to make sure of is the number of games category, because if those numbers are very low, you're not going to have a high enough sample size to actually determine actionable data. So for example, this category only has 14 data points, and so it's not really something you can take knowledge from, because there's only maybe two or three drafts where people have actually drafted this color combination, and so the fact that it has a 50% win rate doesn't really tell you much. So you want to have this baseline. You want to know how many games. So there's been 256,000 games played. So we actually have a pretty large sample size, especially for the more commonly played colors. So now we'll scroll up and look at the two color section of the data page. And what you see here is the aggregate win rate for playing a two color deck is 56.9. So you get a 0.8 percentage point boost compared to the average just by playing a two color deck. And I want to highlight that right now because I think it's very interesting to see that if you play two colors plus a splash, your aggregate win rate goes down by almost 4 percentage points when compared to just playing a two color deck, which tells me that people are splashing too aggressively, they're splashing without mana fixing, and they're potentially splashing cards that aren't really worth splashing. So keep that in mind during your drafts. This is just an immediate thing that you can just notice is there's a massive sample size, almost 210,000 games, almost 33,000 games to get these numbers. And the 4 percentage point gap is telling me that people are splashing too aggressively and that they are not as familiar with what they need to do in order to splash successfully. So you can just see that the numbers massively decrease at that point in time. But let's get into some of the other numbers here. We can see, looking at the highest win percentage deck, it looks like blue-white is the highest win rate deck if you end up in a blue-white deck. But it's also interesting to note that the number of games played with the blue-white deck is 23,000 about, and the next highest win percentage deck, which is blue-black, is at 59.1, so only slightly worse, but it has over twice as many games played with 56,000. So what does these sorts of numbers mean? It may mean that blue-white, when it comes together, is the most successful archetype in the format, but that blue-black is very, very consistent, and so draft in and draft out, blue-black may be a better deck to go for because it might have a lower fail rate. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum. There's been a lot of talk in just general content creation about how weak red-green is. And so red-green, the color of the werewolves tribe predominantly, it has a low win rate, 51.7%. It's got a decent sample size, so 12,500. It doesn't even have the lowest sample size of decks in the format, so that's worth noting. It's not the least played deck, but it does have the lowest win percentage, and then it's followed by blue-red at another pretty low win percentage, especially compared to that 56% number. Now, this may stem from several factors. When you look at these numbers, you want to evaluate them in context and not just take them as raw, this is the way the format is, this is why it's going to be that way. One of the things you might need to recognize is that maybe red-green is weak because it could be potentially a weak color combination, just inherently the cards are weaker. It could also be that red-green matches up poorly against blue-black, and since blue-black is so heavily played, red-green suffers as a result, because there is a little metagame there. You have definitely, almost definitely, I hope, had the experience of you just have a deck that lines up well against your opponent, or you felt the pain of your deck just not lining up well against your opponent's strategy. And that could certainly just be the case with red-green. Maybe it just doesn't line up well against blue-black. And based on my initial estimations, that could easily be the case, that red-green just doesn't line up well against decks that have a lot of the black removal spells. And because black removal is so powerful and so easy, it so easily kills these werewolves that kind of need to stay in play and have it flip, that could be a real factor as to why red-green is weak. So if the blue-black percentages go down, maybe if the deck becomes more contested and less played, maybe red-green could see a bit of a resurgence in that case. So those are the sorts of things to keep in mind. It could also just be that the red cards are a little bit weaker, that the werewolves are not barely pushed, that the overall color combination doesn't have a ton of synergy, and so that's another thing to keep in mind. Another thing to look at is this Izzet deck, the blue-red deck, coming a little bit better than werewolves, but still quite low. And this one is another very interesting data point because, again, it has a reasonable sample size, but it has a very low win rate. And one of the factors with this deck in particular is that it can be very difficult to play a blue-red spells matters deck. It's one of those decks where you need to have the right number of instants and sorceries compared with the right number of spells, and it can be very difficult to know whether or not you're supposed to be an aggressive variant or a more controlling variant, and it just ends up being that Izzet can be a very difficult color combination to pilot, and it means that that could be a factor in lower win rates, because difficulty of execution does not necessarily mean that a color combination is worse inherently, because in the hands of the best pros, maybe the color combinations would shift. So an easier deck would get a higher win percentage because perhaps blue-black zombies just very easy to play or something like that, and blue-red gets a little bit weaker because only the people who are very skilled can actually play the deck, and over 13,000 matches, not everyone playing it is going to be skilled or know how to build it correctly, because there are certainly cards that in a blue-red deck look like they would fit, but they kind of play towards an aggressive game plan, and some of them play towards a more defensive game plan. And then when you just put all those cards together, if you're less experienced, you don't end up with a great deck. There's also a lot of categories in the middle here, and you can kind of just estimate which ones are slightly above average, which ones are a little bit below average, and which color combinations are pretty much dead on average. So this is a very interesting thing to examine. This is the most relevant category, the two color decks, because you can see these massive sample sizes of over 10,000 games played for each of these two color combinations, whereas these monocolored decks just do not have a high number of games played. Monocolor plus splash, monocolored decks, the low number of games played means that you can't really look at that data. Again, very interesting to see just two color plus a splash being such a big hit, especially in some of these color combinations. This just kind of further reinforces the idea that an aggressive deck doesn't really want to splash. So if you look at black-red up here, 54.9% win rate. If you look at black-red down here, 47.9% win rate. So you get a massive hit in your black-red deck, almost actually 7 percentage points when you're splashing a lot of the time, because when you're beating down, you get more punished for splashing, because if you draw your off-color land, it can potentially mess up your curve out, and also not being able to cast some of your spells can give your opponent time to stabilize, even if you think the card that you're splashing is powerful. You can just kind of look at these sorts of numbers. Again, Boros gets pretty punished for splashing, almost a 4 percentage point, above a 4 percentage point drop. Again, comparing these numbers to the average is important. So on average, a deck loses 4 percentage points for splashing. So the ones that lose more or lose less from that is important, because you need to measure against baselines and not against default numbers. That's just a very important concept in data analysis in general, is that you don't want to say well, this number is still above 50%, so it must be good. You need to be well, the average win percentage is 56.1, so 50.2 percentage points is not really good. And then you can be well, you lose 4 percentage points for splashing, but you lose 4.6 when you splash in Boros. So Boros is below average even compared to the normal 4 percentage points you lose, and red-black is particularly egregious in that sort of regard, whereas a deck like Simic, which is maybe going to be more controlling sometimes, doesn't lose quite as much when splashing, 58% compared to 55.2. So that's about 2.8 percentage points, which is a decent amount below the average. So those are the sorts of things to keep in mind when you are evaluating these sorts of numbers, and I find that to be a very useful part of the page. It is important to make sure that you look at this page as a baseline and make sure that there is a relevant number of games played before you come to any conclusions. With so many games played at this point in the format, there are some trends starting to emerge, but you also want to make sure that you do factor in that analysis, such as blue-black potentially having a good matchup against red-green and holding that down. And then as the format progresses, if this number percent starts to decline, if the people start contesting it more, maybe red-green can rise up or things like that. These decks on the lower end of the spectrum, maybe blue-red becomes more figured out or things of that nature. So you want to make sure that you're not just looking at the numbers, you're thinking about why those numbers may be the case and then factoring that into your analysis. Anyway, that is going to do it for this episode of Drafting with Data. I really do hope you found it interesting. And remember that if you want to check out the numbers yourself, you can head on over to 17lands.com. If you did make it all the way to the end of this video, in the comments section down below, leave hashtag poor werewolves to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, because red-green unfortunately not getting its time in the sun, despite the set being werewolf themed with Midnight Hunt in the title. Remember that if you did enjoy this video and enjoy the Drafting with Data series, to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel for more content, more draft content, including future episodes of Drafting with Data, and also comment below with your questions, thoughts, feedback, what you think of the data. And also you can find the first episode of Drafting with Data where I show you how to analyze the games in hand win rate percentage numbers. You can find that linked down below or elsewhere on my channel. So that is going to do it for this episode. I really do hope you enjoyed it and found it useful, and I will talk to you next time.